All right, everyone, thank you for tuning in to another episode of Honest Defense. Today, I'm honored to be joined by Alec Klein. Alec is a best-selling author and an award-winning journalist who formerly wrote for the Washington Post and the Wall Street Journal. His investigations help free prisoners who were wrongfully convicted of crimes up to murder. He has helped dozens of excessively sentenced prisoners gain their freedom through parole and commutation. Alec was also a professor at the Medill School of Journalism at Northwestern, and he was also the director of the Medill Justice Project. In 2018, Alex was accused of sexual misconduct by students and staffers at Medill, and he voluntarily resigned from his job there. Last year, he wrote a book titled Aftermath: What It Felt Like When Life Was Over, detailing his experiences. Alec, thank you so much for joining me.
Happy to be here.
So I actually want to start with your journalism career. I was curious what got you interested in journalism. I know your dad was an award-winning journalist himself. I'm sure that was a big influence. Was there anything else that propelled you to that career?
Well, it was very much probably my father's influence. He was the editor-in-chief of the New York Times Magazine when I was growing up. And so I spent a lot of time around journalism and around the New York Times and around what he did. So I think that kind of got me interested in the field, and it almost felt like a natural evolution to go into the same business, really.
Was there something about investigative journalism that particularly attracted you? It's a Shakespearean level irony when you get into what it was you were actually doing as a journalist and then what later happened to you at Northwestern. I was curious what attracted you to that specific.
Yeah, no, I think that's a great question. I think I naturally gravitated towards investigations and the uncovering of wrongdoing from the earliest stages of my career. It wasn't something that I was sort of pushed into, but I found myself drawn to that, trying to figure out where there was some sort of wrongdoing and seeing if there was a way to shed light on it and to hopefully do something about it through my journalism. And so that's sort of where it always went. And I'm not really sure why that is. I can't tell you, except for the fact that, I often think about, what's the point of what we're doing here? And in my mind, it's about, helping other people, making a difference, having an impact. And I think that as far as journalism is concerned, one great way to have an impact is through investigative journalism. So that was where I ended up.
Was there a particular story or case that you worked on that really stuck with you from those days?
Oh gosh, there's so many. I mean, actually, one of the first investigations I did when I was a cub reporter in my early 20s was about how I was covering City Hall in a southern city, and I found out that they were using taxpayer money to funnel secret bonuses to the top executives of the city, and then putting it into a police and fire retirement system, which it wasn't really about. And when I wrote that investigation, I'll never forget it. I actually got, flowers sent to my desk in the newsroom. There was a move to oust the mayor until the mayor apologized publicly for it. And I realized how much of an impact we can have if we're doing this kind of work. But I have to tell you, over the years, I've really been humbled, if I can say that, by the investigations. When I was at the Washington Post, I investigated the AOL Time Warner merger, which was the largest merger in US history, and it created the largest media company in the world. And I was able to spend many months investigating how they were essentially inflating their advertising revenue to pull off the biggest merger in US history. When I did that investigation at the Washington Post, the impact was almost immediate. The Justice Department had launched a criminal investigation. The SEC launched an investigation. The company had to restate 2 years of their financial results. They ended up paying, I think, $500 million in fines. And so that was really kind of shocking to watch how this unfolds. But more recently, I've been investigating cases where people are either excessively sentenced or wrongfully convicted. And it's a really beautiful thing to see when somebody is set free from something that they didn't deserve. In fact, this just happened weeks ago. I helped a man who was sentenced to life in prison in Oklahoma. He had been sentenced to life after a spate of purse snatchings in the 1980s. And it seemed excessive that you would spend the rest of your life. I'm not saying purse snatching is a good thing.
Right.
Do you really want to spend the rest of your life when actually I think the average sentence for murder is something like 15 years?
Right.
So I was able to investigate that case with a number of other people. We published the investigation, and ultimately the governor of Oklahoma signed the commutation, and he was set free right before Christmas, actually, to be with his ill mother. And it's a wonderful, beautiful thing to see. I continue to help other inmates with their cases and investigate other cases where people are either wrongfully convicted or excessively sentenced. And I have to tell you, if you're not in that field, you may think, well, gosh, that probably doesn't happen. But I can tell you, it does happen. People are frequently wrongfully accused or wrongfully convicted of various things. It happens all the time, especially in the world we live in today.
When it comes to excessive sentencing, how does that even happen that someone gets sentenced to life for purse snatching? Because it seems like one of those things, it's not even a partisan issue. I would think people across the political spectrum would think that's ridiculous for someone to have to spend life for something like that.
Well, I can tell you it's a great question because I actually spoke to the one of the prosecutors involved in that county, and he talked about some of the inmates as a cancer on society. And I thought, gosh, I believe in second chances. I believe in redemption. I believe in compassion. And I think some people don't. There was another case, by the way, in Oklahoma where I helped a woman who was sentenced to life in prison after failing drug court. So in other words, she was a drug addict, but she wasn't a violent offender in any way. But she had actually been sentenced to life in prison after failing drug court. But I was able to help her also regain her freedom. That was about a year ago, and she was able to be reunited with her children and her family. And that to me is, both humbling, but also it just inspires me because I know that it impacts so many people. It's not even just the individual, it's their children, it's their families, it's their communities. So it's something that means a lot to me. And, I'm sort of grateful that I'm able to help some people with that.
And when it comes to these wrongful conviction cases, do you notice any kind of thread among those cases? Is it just kind of prosecutorial zeal, or is there some through line?
There are some common elements that you will notice over time, and it can be prosecutors who have what's called tunnel vision. So they may see that there's a suspect, and they'll focus on that suspect. It's not just the prosecutors; it could be the police as well. In other cases, people will actually confess to a crime that they didn't commit. This is either through coercion or because it's a plea deal because they feel like they have no other choice. There are all sorts of, if I can give you just one example.
Please.
There was a case in Florida that I investigated where a man was sentenced to life in prison based essentially on one eyewitness who said that he was 60% sure that this guy was the bad guy. And I thought to myself, wait a minute, 60% sure, that's kind of a toss-up, isn't it? So now when I looked into the case, I did this again with a number of other people, excellent journalists. We were able to identify a key eyewitness whom the authorities could not find. His nickname was Maniac. That's all we had was his nickname. Turns out there are a lot of people who have a nickname called Maniac. But we found the right maniac who happened to be in a prison in Florida. We weren't sure that it was the right maniac, but I thought, let's just go down there and see if we can interview this guy. And the people I was working with said, well, what happens if we have the wrong maniac? And I said, well, then we have the wrong maniac. But how else are we going to figure this out? You have to be willing to fail to succeed. And so we went down to Florida. We interviewed this guy, Maniac, in a prison. And in fact, it was the right maniac. And he said that he had actually witnessed the murder. He had just saw it. It was late at night. And that the guy that they put away, he didn't even know. He said that wasn't the killer because he knew the killer. And he said they got the wrong guy. When that happened, we did a big story about this. And I have to tell you that the authorities were not terribly pleased because they already had a conviction. And at first, they frankly were pretty aggressive with us, even though we were simply just the messengers of this information. But in the end, the judge did free this inmate who had been sentenced to life in prison, and he's home free. But this actually happens not infrequently And it's kind of scary if you think about it, because we have in the United States, you'd think one of the best criminal justice systems in the world. But in a sense, we also have the most known wrongful convictions, I believe, in the world. So it's really a problem. We incarcerate, I believe, over 2 million people in the United States, which I think on a per capita basis is more than any other country in the world, except for maybe some small island nation.
North Korea, right.
Well, we don't know about North Korea because they don't put up their numbers, but they exceed us. But we're doing something, and it's costing an absolute fortune in taxpayer money to incarcerate all these individuals. So it's a real problem in the world we live in today. And it's something that people may not be fully aware of unless you're somehow connected to it. You have a family member, you have a friend or another. But I can tell you, I talk to inmates all the time. They call me, they write to me, and there's a lot of suffering. You can hear it in their voices, and especially with COVID, where they're sort of trapped in this system, there's real risk. Now, people will say, well, gosh, they did something wrong. And there are obviously a number of inmates who have done something they shouldn't have done. And I'm not excusing that. But I'm also saying that there are cases where somebody has been either wrongfully convicted or excessively sentenced. And I also do believe, by the way, in forgiveness. I'm helping an inmate right now who has spent about 30 years in prison. And she has no possibility of parole based on her sentence. But, my feeling is, even though she was convicted of first-degree murder and she did have a role, my feeling is that, at what point do we say to ourselves or to each other, that this person has served their time, they have changed, they are no longer a threat to society, they deserve a second chance. And maybe it's just my opinion, and it's not worth probably much of anything, but I believe in second chances and compassion and forgiveness, and that when you talk to individuals who are behind bars, it's torture. It's really bad in there.
And that seems to be an issue that's infecting all of society now, where people just don't want to give anyone a second chance. It's one offense, even one perceived offense, and we want to cut you out.
It's such a great point. We live, I think, in a very difficult time. I think you're really referring to cancel culture, where so many people are so quick to essentially, cast out an individual because they don't like their opinion, they don't agree with them, they don't like what they did or said. And this is happening, as you probably know, throughout the world, in the United States in particular. And I have to tell you, I find it really alarming, because it's very much like in contradiction to the First Amendment, which is this idea that we are allowed to speak our mind and say what we want to say, and that was actually one of the sort of essential elements of this nation that made it so great, in my opinion. And yet we've sort of thrown that out. And I think it's a function of the internet, the rise of the internet and the rise of social media, because it's so easy to just push the button when you have a reaction. But I'm worried in many ways for children more than anything, because they're, not protected from this. And so their friends and others can say terrible things about them, even if they're not true. And actually, there have been a number of these cases, documented cases, where kids have actually killed themselves because of things that have been said about them. And to me, that's absolutely heartbreaking. And, and I think something needs to be done about it. And yet, you can't legislate kindness or compassion. You can't make people that way. But so I think it stems from somewhere else, and we have to make it better. But we're in a very difficult time right now, where there's so much anger and vitriol, if you will. And I'm hoping that we kind of emerge from that, and that there's more kindness and compassion going forward. But, frankly, I'm not sure when that'll happen.
Yeah, it feels like there's still a bottom that's yet to, fall out from all of this. And
absolutely,
I mean, I agree with you so much. I've always felt like I can disagree with someone on any issue, but as long as we can agree on the fact that everyone deserves a voice, everyone deserves to be heard, we can live in the same place. But we're shifting now, where we don't even agree on that foundational principle of everyone deserves to be heard.
It's true. It's a form of tyranny when you can't speak your mind. I mean, if you think about other nations that are sort of controlled by dictatorships, where you can't actually express your opinion, that's tyranny. And the whole idea of where we live in the United States, what makes us so great, I think, is the fact that we're actually able to say what we want to say. We can disagree with our leaders. We can protest. We can speak our minds. And I think that's healthy. It's just a question about, like, do we just discard somebody because we don't like their opinion? And I think that that's wrong. Yeah. I mean, they should be allowed to have their opinion, even if we don't agree with it. And so, I don't know how we get back to that, but it's a real problem in today's world.
Did you feel any kind of negative blowback from any of your reporting? I mean, reporting on AOL Time Warner, there's tens, hundreds of billions of dollars at stake. Did you get any pushback or feel any kind of personal attacks from that? Or again, working with these individual prisoners and trying to help them get some freedom?
I would say that it comes with the territory. If you're going to powerful forces, they're going to come after you. And so there have been, many attempts to destroy me or get me fired or to hurt me in some way. And on the AOL Time Warner merger, that investigation, as you pointed out, it literally was billions of dollars were at stake. And even while I was working on the investigation, apparently somehow word was beginning to leak out that I was on this investigation, and the company's stock price was already beginning to hemorrhage. So people were by the billions. And so there was a lot at stake, and they hired actually a high-powered law firm to try to get the story killed. And it was pretty scary, actually, because I was sort of under tremendous pressure. They were trying to get the story killed. They were trying to discredit me. They were trying to discredit the facts. Fortunately, I had, a lot of documentation and sources that, showed really what was going on. And I worked for an organization, by the way, the Washington Post, that was used to dealing with powerful forces and not yielding to it. But it was, it's an intense part of the job, really, trying to help people who are up against powerful forces. It comes with the territory. I've been in a lot of areas where, I'm not totally sure if I'm going to get out of it totally safely. But I don't mean to glamorize it, because it's not glamorous, and there are moments when I feel a bit of fear. But I think if you're going to try to do something to help people who don't have much help, it's not going to be easy. And I used to always joke that if it were easy, then everybody would do it, right? But it's because it's difficult that we do it. It's because nobody else is doing it, we should do it. And I'm not looking for the quick victory. I'm looking to help people who need help, but it's tough, absolutely.
When you say the law firm was trying to get this story killed, what were their actual tactics? What were they doing to try to?
Well, it's a great question. So this was pretty complicated. It was about the finances of the biggest media company in the world, but they even had their accountant, their outside auditor, reconfirm the appropriateness of all of the transactions that I was questioning through my investigation. They were saying, hey, there's absolutely nothing wrong with any of these transactions. And if you publish those stories, you're in big trouble. And I remember thinking, I was actually walking towards the Washington Post one morning thinking, gosh, I'm going to bring down this entire company with this one story if I'm even slightly wrong. But once the stories ran, the company actually admitted that they had improperly inflated their revenues, and they made all sorts of actions to try to make up for it. But before the stories ran, there was all this pressure that they were trying to present that it was fine, but it wasn't fine. And there's now a long history that shows that the reporting was accurate and fair. And in fact, I remember getting a phone call the day of the first day of the stories, the series, and it was from an executive from the very company that was trying to kill the stories and destroy me at the same time. And the call said, the guy said, hey, congratulations. And I was kind of taken aback because I thought he was going to yell at me, and I said, well, what do you mean? He said, well, you looked into the jaws of death and you came out all right. That was a direct quote.
Wow. I
remember thinking, wow, that's not what I expected. But I think that they at least appreciated that we gave them about 6 weeks to respond to all of the allegations. And in fact, I put it in writing, and it was, I think, about 21 pages, single spaced, and they had all sorts of time so we were fair about presenting the information to them. And by the way, that's not the media world we live in today.
Right.
Because the way that things work now is that anybody can say anything about anyone just by the push of a button on social media. Yeah. In fact, what's happened is because of that, the traditional media outlets are also putting out information that is unverified, and in some cases utterly damaging to people and institutions, because it's the new journalism. But it's just the way the world is today, and it's unfortunate because as a journalist, both at the Washington Post and the Wall Street Journal, you couldn't simply put something out there that would, like, for instance, damage you without absolutely verifying it, being utterly sure that it's accurate and double checking with you and giving you the opportunity to respond. But that's not the case anymore. People just put it out there. I mean, I've seen all sorts of stories where it's even the crawl on the TV says, this is just a rumor, this is unverified. And I'm like, well, wait a minute, if it's a rumor, if it's unverified, why are you telling it to me? Because it may be totally wrong, but it can have a huge impact on people's lives.
It seems like such a double-edged sword, as with anything with the internet, I guess, because it's great that people can kind of fact check some of the bigger institutions, and they can't just push one singular narrative. I like the fact that I can see what's going on the ground and I don't have to have it filtered. But like you said, there's a major cost to that, which is because there's no filter, there's much lower levels of fact checking and of assuring that you're getting the truth.
Yeah, I mean, I think you're right that there are obviously benefits to the internet, and I don't mean to say otherwise. And you're right that we can get information from a variety of sources much wider than it used to be, right? It's not just like 3 networks on television. We can get it from all sorts, which is good. My concern is that it's so fast and loose because of the speed of the internet and the fact that, a small blog is competing with the New York Times. And so they're trying to level the playing field. And so they're both putting out the information super fast, not necessarily verifying it before they put it out there. And it can be so damaging. And, I've actually studied some of the history of journalism. We've been through different periods when the standards were different. And they're different again right now in the sense that the idea of confirming the facts doesn't apply. And so I think that's why a lot of people don't even believe what they consume as readers or as news people. We kind of they go to one station or another outlet, and actually I do this too. Sometimes I'll double check a couple of different outlets to see, wait a minute, what are the facts here? But there's so much opinion in news, and it's you see this all the time, and it's injected right in the news stories, which wasn't allowed, not so long ago. But so the fact that there's opinion injected, and sometimes a little more subtle, it influences how we perceive that news. And so, sometimes I don't really know what to believe.
Yeah. And I think you feel like every American right now, which is you're hearing completely opposite things from different outlets, and it's hard to know who to trust.
Absolutely. I think you're absolutely right about that. Yes.
So you're working at one of the biggest journalistic institutions in the country. You're working on some of the biggest stories in the country, in the world. What was it that made you want to leave that and go into the ivory tower?
Well, when I was at the Washington Post as an investigative reporter, when I did the AOL Time Warner investigation, I was invited to speak about the investigation at a number of universities and other places as well. But I did that, and I remember thinking, gosh, this is great, to be in a situation where you're talking to young people who want to make a difference in the world, who are idealistic, who, as I am, and who are inspired by doing things that help others. And so that led me to first teaching part-time at American University when I was still at the Washington Post as an investigative reporter. And then I taught at Georgetown University, also part-time while I was at the Washington Post. And I remember a lot of my colleagues at the Post said, what are you doing? Why are you, teaching on top of your, day job at the Washington Post? And I said, because I like it. It's fun. It's inspiring. I enjoyed, being with students and helping them learn and thinking that it might have a positive impact. I mean, I've been fortunate that I've had a lot of good teachers in my life. And so at that point, there was an opportunity that came up at Northwestern, and I was brought in as a full tenured professor teaching there. investigative journalism and other courses. And it seemed like a good sort of segue. I'd already been at the Washington Post for about, I think it was 8 years, and before that at the Wall Street Journal. And so I thought it would be a good fit for me. And since I enjoyed so much working with students, and that's how I ended up there.
And you were kind of continuing some of your work too. I mean, you started the name of the project, the Justice Project.
Yeah, well, at first, when I joined Northwestern, I was a professor teaching investigative journalism and some other courses. But then about 3 years into my time at the university, there was a big scandal where a famous professor was accused of ethical misconduct, and he was ousted. And when he was ousted, there was no longer a head of what was then called the Medill Innocence Project, and it was a famous organization at the university that helped people who were wrongfully convicted. And they said, would you take it over, because it was in jeopardy of collapse at that time. And it was such an important part of the university for students, for the faculty, for the university, and also for people who were wrongfully convicted.
Right.
So I did it. I said I would take it over out of a sense of responsibility to help out. So I took over the Medill Innocence Project, and then I later renamed it the Medill Justice Project, and I did that for a number of years, helping people who were wrongfully convicted.
Was there anything from that time period that stuck out, any individual or case?
Well, yes, there were a number of cases where we were fortunate enough to help individuals be freed from wrongful convictions. Actually, one of the first ones was Jennifer Del Creed. She was a daycare worker who had been convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to 20 years in prison based on what's called a shaken baby syndrome case. And she was accused of, violently hurting an infant in her care. We investigated the case, and we uncovered a letter that had never seen the light of day before in the court proceeding. That letter was from a police detective involved in the investigation. And what it said essentially, and I'm paraphrasing, was that the doctor who conducted the autopsy was not convinced that it was a shaken baby syndrome case, was not convinced that it was murder. And so yet this letter had never seen the light of day, even though it pointed to this inmate's innocence. And so we did an investigation. We put this letter out there for people to see. Her lawyers actually took that letter, entered it into a federal court proceeding to say, look, this is what's called a Brady violation, which is a violation of her constitutional rights. The federal judge agreed, reopened the whole hearing, brought in a whole bunch of people. Ultimately, the federal judge set her free, and she went home, and her conviction, I believe, was overturned after that by the state court. And I'll never forget that moment that we saw her right at the prison gates. She had just been released, and she was reuniting with her daughter and her family. And it was so moving to see somebody who had been through such hell. She'd had her nose broken, I think, multiple times in prison for no particular reason, by the way. And then we took her to lunch. We went to, I can't remember the name of the restaurant, but it was a chain restaurant. And she hadn't had a salad in 10 years, because you don't get a fresh salad in prison. She hadn't used like a stainless steel fork in 10 years. And I think she had a steak, which she also hadn't had in 10 years. But I have to say, even though the celebration was beautiful, I remember that it was difficult for her to adjust to life on the outside afterwards, because you get so used to being institutionalized in prison. And it was a real struggle for her. She was living in a friend's basement, and she would often struggle just to go outside because you're not used to being outside. And she actually asked her friend whose house it was whether she could take a shower, because she was so used to asking for permission in prison. Yeah. And so it's really it's something people don't know, but it's really difficult, not only when you're in prison, but when you get out of prison too. There are very few resources to help them.
I think there's a lot of analogs. I come from a military family. I have a lot of friends who are veterans, and I think it's the same thing coming home from war. I've seen them struggle to get back to just doing normal things. And I'm sure prison's the same way, that you're living a completely different life. And for them, it's 24/7 for years on years.
Yeah.
I don't know how we expect them to be able to just, assimilate right back in.
Yeah, it's very difficult, and I do think there are some comparisons, as you point out. Absolutely.
And I'm sure one of those successful cases, when you see someone like that being able to enjoy a salad, I'm sure that powers you through, the next 100 people who might not be as successful.
Well, the funny thing about that story was, we rushed to the prison to greet this inmate on her freedom, and then we rushed to some little hotel to write the stories, and we were up till about, I think, 2 o'clock in the morning writing these stories, and they were being picked up by different media outlets around the country and the world. And then the next morning, I drove back to the office in the same clothing I'd worn the day before, and I went back to work.
Wow.
That's just the way it was.
Wow. So you're at Northwestern, you're working on these cases, you're teaching classes, you're getting reviews for every class you teach from students. Like, as a typical professor would, you get these anonymous reviews at the end of every semester.
Yeah.
Nothing really negatives coming from that. You're getting positive reviews. And then please.
I was just going to say, it's actually the opposite. These anonymous reviews, which, as you know, students do of all of their professors, they were overwhelmingly effusive in their praise of the experience, and the class that I taught was among the highest rated classes, and never was there any complaints of any kind of mistreatment of any kind. In fact, there were waiting lists for students to join the class.
Wow. And so correct me if I'm wrong on the timeline here, but I think the first time you heard of any accusations was in this letter that was sent to the university.
Well, actually, it began in, I want to say, about 2015. The center that I ran was beginning to expand. We were growing. We were going from a local organization to a national one. We had hired an administrative assistant, essentially a secretary. She actually didn't report directly to me. She reported to somebody else who reported to me. But she was on what's called a corrective action plan, which meant that she was not performing her job duties well, and she was in jeopardy of being fired as a result of it. And instead of sticking with the job, she quickly resigned and then turned around and accused me of harassment. And it was sort of a shocking experience, because the university then investigated it by interviewing a lot of former and current students and former and current staffers. And what they found was that she had somehow, they caught her in a number of documented lies, and they ruled against her. And she continued to appeal it, and they ruled against her again. Ultimately, the university said, look, this is becoming a drain on our resource and time. We recommend that we reach a settlement with her, between the university and her. And so she agreed to the settlement, in which she acknowledged that I did nothing wrong. And they paid her, I think, $5,000 net. And she agreed never to bring this up, because it was obviously would be harmful to my reputation. She was actually also told in the agreement that she could never even apply for another job again at the university. But that became the foundation of the press accusation at the height of the Me Too movement. So one of the individuals that they had interviewed as a part of that 2015 investigation was a former graduate student who had worked for me. I had eventually let her go. I didn't fire her, but I didn't renew her appointment, and she was very upset about that. And so when she was interviewed by the university about the secretary's allegations, that was just great ammunition for somebody who wanted, it seems, revenge. So she used those. It's actually, the university actually reached out to all the people that had interviewed about the allegations by the secretary to let them know that they were unfounded and that this should remain confidential. But the former grad student who I had let go as an employee, she ended up using that as the main bullet points in her media attack against me in 2018, but it was certainly not made clear in the media attack that these were unfounded allegations, that she had actually been told were unfounded accusations. And so once that went out, this again was at the height of the Me Too movement, it was like wildfire. And I was instantly destroyed. Even students whom I had not taught started a petition drive to have me ousted. Other students whom I didn't know and had not taught created a template on Facebook to tell people how to make complaints against me. So they, were sort of like you fill in the blanks kind of thing. And professors who knew nothing about any of the facts put out a public letter to the accusers, sympathizing with them. And it was utterly devastating, really, for my children in particular. My daughter went to school, and I guess she saw that I was sort of face down on the rug in the dining room, and she was trying to figure out what was going on. She went to the school library to read some of the stories, and she came home. She wanted to talk about it, so we talked about it because I wanted her to understand. And it was a very difficult conversation. She was about 11, I think, at the time. And this is somebody that I had raised to be to believe in social justice. In fact, we had Rosie the Riveter in her room, and she, of course, knew that these were false allegations, but she cried about it. And it's interesting, in the years since, she's been angry at those who made these accusations. And I told her that to forgive, and to show compassion. And she always says, she doesn't feel that compassion, but I've let it go. But it was really difficult. My father tried to commit suicide right in the middle of it, and almost succeeded. And so it was this surreal experience where, your entire life is utterly destroyed, and you see your family suffering. It was not just my father who tried to commit suicide. I wanted to die, and I could see the suffering that my kids were going through in particular, and all the things that I'd worked for decades was utterly destroyed. My career was ended. But it's interesting. It's kind of like being a leper from the Bible, where you're cast out of society. And so it's not simply the destruction of your career, which is no longer there. It's that you're socially also murdered. And so you're not allowed to maintain your relationships. Many people just sort of disappear and ghost you. And I consider it sort of the gift that keeps giving. It's been about 3 years since this all happened. And yet it comes up, I would say, almost every day of my life. But in addition to that, it's the fact that you can't, it's very difficult to move on. So, at my age, with my career largely just utterly destroyed, how do you move forward? I was thinking of the people I help who've been convicted of murder. If they are finally paroled or commuted, in many ways, it is a very difficult struggle for them to continue their lives when they get out, but they're at least allowed to they've paid their, due to society in their lives to move on. But those who've been cast out because of cancel culture are not really allowed to move on. They're supposed to remain utterly destroyed, both in terms of their career and socially. And I've actually heard from a number of people who have been canceled in different walks of life. And it's really sad. I mean, that's not even really capturing it, because I can hear the suffering in their voice, and I understand what they're going through. And I have to say, for the most part, they have not been able to move on. They haven't been able to figure out even how to make a living for their children, or have health insurance. And in many cases, these were people who were in positions of authority or power, a little bit like me. And so once they've lost that, there's really, where do you go from there? How do you move on? And so, especially given your age, but it's actually, I've talked to people who it's happened to them in their 30s and their 40s and their 50s. And it's really, it kind of reminds me of McCarthyism, actually, the Red Scare, because when that happened and people were accused of being communists, it had the effect of, in many instances, destroying them both professionally, but killing them socially. And in some cases, they just literally walked out of their lives. They said, I'm going to go get the milk, and then they never returned, or they killed themselves.
Right.
And it was only years later that, we look back on it and said, gosh, that was such a crazy period where just the unfounded whiff of an accusation of being a communist was enough to utterly kill somebody and destroy them. And the fact is that today the internet has been weaponized, and people do understand that it's a way to, get revenge, to hurt somebody. And it's incredibly effective because it follows you wherever you go. So I was joking with somebody that I need to move to like some, island nation where they have no internet and don't speak English. But, it's just, I try to make light of it, but it's, but the truth is that it's a painful struggle. And my heart goes out to those who've been through it. I think it's hard for other people to understand. I've actually seen some stories about this who say, oh, what's the big deal? They've just, lost their job. But it's actually much, much worse than that. Because again, as I said, it doesn't even affect just yourself, but your family and your community. And it's even, it hurts a lot of other people. So it's something that, I hope we get to a point where we don't do this, where we don't cancel people. Because I do think it's actually quite dangerous and damaging. But that's essentially what happened. In my case, by the way, I was never sanctioned by the university. I was not fired. I voluntarily resigned. Somebody was asking me on TV, well, why didn't you, I would have fought this to the death. And I said, well, first of all, I did fight it for many months. But one thing you have to keep in mind is that it costs an absolute fortune in lawyers to fight this. And it's very difficult to continue to fight it when you're running out of money, essentially. You have to make a decision about what's best for your family, what's best for, kind of moving forward. But I did fight it for many months. And then I realized that, I just didn't have the heart in me to keep fighting. I didn't want to fight anymore. And so I voluntarily resigned because I couldn't see a way forward anyway with the university. And also, more importantly, I was seeing the suffering of my own children in my family. And I realized that I just needed to let it go. And I did. And so, and it's funny, when I wrote the book, it wasn't really intended to be a book. I happen to be a writer by trade. And so during all of this, I was having trouble sleeping. And I woke up, around 4 something in the morning. And I had really nothing to do because I had no job, I had no career, nothing. So I started, writing my thoughts on the laptop, more just as I guess it was just as a journal to myself, really. But I found myself sitting at the desk doing this every day. And then I realized after I was like, oh, wait a minute, I think this is actually more than just a journal to myself. But that's what it started out as. And I had really no expectations of it ever getting published. In fact, I had lost, not only my career, but my literary agent of many years who had represented me on other books that we had done together, dropped me based on a 20-second conversation where, I didn't get a real chance to explain myself. But so I had no literary agent, and my publisher had distanced themselves from me. And so when I wrote this, I actually did find a publisher that loved the book, and it was called Aftermath. But then some of the same accusers who attacked and destroyed me tried to scare the publisher from publishing the book. And they actually did back out of the deal. The publisher did, and I thought that that was the end of it. But then suddenly another publisher appeared literally within a matter of days, and they published the book Aftermath in I want to say May of this year, last year. But it was not really intended to even be a book, and it's mostly, as the title suggests, about what happens afterwards in the destruction, and how do we deal with. How do we, we all go through suffering, right? We all go through difficulties. It's impossible, I think, to go through life, no matter who you are, without some sort of pain and suffering. It comes with the territory. And I think a lot of the book was about, how do we deal with our suffering, with the pain that we go through in life. That was, I think, a large part of it for me.
There's so much I want to unpack there. First,
Yeah.
you mentioned how you lost your agent. You also mentioned in the book about losing lawyers, and that, as a lawyer myself, that broke my heart because it's lawyers that are supposed to be there as the last line of defense, of
Yeah.
justice and due process. And you're not the that's not the only time I've heard this, of lawyers refusing to take up cases of certain people because of the bad PR. And it breaks my heart, it disgusts me, it sickens me to my core to hear that happen.
It was absolutely shocking, actually, because you know you if you can't rely on your lawyers to help defend you, I mean, how do you defend yourself? I mean, actually, you know this, I'm sure, but defending it against people destroying your reputation is actually quite difficult. Defamation and libel are very difficult to prove. It can cost an absolute fortune, and there's no guarantee it's going to lead to anything. And so, that's one thing. But even beyond that, because this was at the height of the Me Too movement, you're right, lawyers were ducking for cover too. They didn't want to be associated with any whiff of the Me Too movement because they were afraid that they were going to be taken down. I mean, everybody was afraid.
Right.
And that too is kind of a form of tyranny when you're so afraid that you're not willing to stand up. And actually, that to me was utterly shocking to see. But yeah, I mean, essentially I lost everything, and it all happened like that, in the flash of an instant. And I often think about that, how easy it is to lose everything so quickly. And in some ways it does put things in perspective because, I've never really been driven by material things. It's not really about the money. It's not about the recognition. It was always about the actual work I do, and so when you see how easy it is to lose everything and how quickly people can just, pass judgment, in some ways it actually makes me more compassionate about other people because I realize that, other people are going through all sorts of things that I may not even be aware of, that they're going through all sorts of difficulties or pain or suffering, and that there's a reason why they're acting the way they are, and that I should just be patient and understanding of that. And it's something I think, so there are some silver linings to it about, learning to be more empathetic and compassionate about what people are going through.
Did your work give you any insight into the psychology of why people want to pile on, people who didn't know you,
Yeah.
people who had probably didn't know the accusers? They just hear, this story, probably they see a headline and they're ready to jump on.
It's such a great question, and I've given this some thought. There's a lot of dynamics involved because what was not understood when this happened to me is that what was put out in the media was actually wildly false and quite radically different than the actual complaints that were made with the university, which were confidential. So for instance, there were several students who complained about their grades. That was their complaint. It was like they wanted an A- instead of a B+. They wanted a B+ instead of an A-. One was still upset, I think 9 years after the fact, that she got a 71 on some test, that I didn't even remember. And it's really hard to understand because there was another student who accused me of mocking her foreign accent on a trip to Florida. It was a class trip to Florida. And first of all, my mother speaks with a foreign accent. But beyond that, I found a number of emails from this very same student thanking me for the experience that she had in my class and how wonderful it was. So I was like, wait a minute, that seems totally different. And then as I thought about it, I was like, well, wait a minute, was I even in Florida? So I checked my records. I wasn't in the state of Florida on that trip when she accused me of this. And it's this crazy thing. There was I think this answers your question too. There was another student who literally days before the public attack in the media had emailed me saying what a wonderful experience she had with me as a student and as an intern. And she was now, in the workforce. She had graduated. And she said, but she had such a wonderful experience. Was there another opportunity that she could continue to work with me? Well, a few days later, after the public attack in the media, she suddenly turned around and accused me of being a predator. And I was like, I didn't understand how you could go from wonderful experience, I want to work with you, to you're a predator. And the thing is that went out there anonymously like wildfire on the internet. So it's, predator. And then once the university started to ask her some questions, and I actually provided the university with the emails that she had provided to me, saying that she had a wonderful experience, she stopped responding to the university's inquiry. And yet, even though she dropped out of it and her accusations were just, utterly nonsense, it was out there on the internet, and it lives forever, And so to your question about how does this happen, I think that, in this particular case, when the former employee put out that public attack, it was it had the effect of, sort of inciting people to make them angry, and so when they're angry, they want to take down the monster. And so when they want to take down the monster, they were all kind of piling on, thinking that they were doing some good by helping, because it's all about the numbers when it comes to these things, which is, if it's a he said, she said, and there's no evidence of any kind of wrongdoing, which there wasn't in this case, then it's about the numbers, right? So people have often said, well, there were 21 complaints, how do you explain that? And I said, well, first of all, none of the complaints to the university involved any kind of sexual interaction, even though that's what it seems like on the internet. It was about grades. It was actually, one of the other ones was
the Hershey Kiss story.
What's that?
Can you tell the Hershey Kiss story? That was the one that made me want to throw my
book
across
the room. Two stories that I think I'll bring. One that I think that people don't know about, that was that several students complained about a chair in my office, saying that it was slightly lower to the ground than my chair, and they called it a power differential. That chair was like a futon chair for my small kids to sit in, but the weird thing is I don't understand that, because I had other chairs in my office. But you can't make a college student sit in any particular chair. They're going to sit where they want to sit. But as far as the Hershey Kiss story, kind of a surreal experience was that, as a part of the interrogation, first of all, I was not allowed to have a lawyer present with me, even though I was being grilled by a lawyer. And I was not allowed to record the proceedings. So it was a black box, which is also really problematic. And I was also not allowed to present the hundreds of witnesses that could speak to my conduct, because they called them character witnesses. But so in the case of the Hershey's Kiss story, the investigator who was grilling me asked if there was a girl in college, when I was in college, which was about 1 million years ago, who I liked, named Emily. And I said that, yeah, there was, and she said, well, what happened with that? Tell us the Hershey's Kiss story. And I said, okay. I said, the story was that there was a girl in college I liked, and I happened to have one of those Hershey's Kisses in my pocket, and she didn't know that I had it. And we were talking, and I said something like, would you like a kiss? And she looked at me and said, okay. But I was so afraid and nervous that I took out the Hershey's Kiss and I gave her the Hershey's Kiss, even though I was madly in love with her. And I had told that story to some students over the years as an example of, don't be afraid to put yourself out there, that life is, can be scary, but, don't have regrets about, what you do. And I remember, so the lawyers, I told the story to the lawyer that was interrogating me. They were taking furious notes while I was saying this. And I was thinking to myself, well, I don't really know what the point of that story is, but some of the accusers said that went on television about that story, the Hershey's Kiss story, calling it a story of a sexual nature. And I remember asking one of my lawyers, I said, is this story a story of a sexual nature? They said, no, it's the opposite. There was nothing that actually happened.
Right.
Yeah, and I remember thinking
anti-sexual.
It was actually, there was literally nothing happened. But that was, they used that as an example on television to take me down, among other things. Yeah, and so I make a joke about this in the book, that not only did I not get the girl, but I continued to get humiliated about it decades later. So yeah.
Is there, because you're now, I think, the fourth professor or former professor I've talked to who's been through one of these Inquisition style hearings. So it's hard for me to now be outraged by these individual cases, and as opposed to being now outraged just by it feels that the entire system is fundamentally I don't even want to say broken, because it seems like this is by design. Do you have that same feeling?
Well, I think it's another great question. So the way that these allegations unfold, it falls under what's called Title IX, and Title IX was intended to, as I understand it, and I'm not a lawyer, but it was intended to prevent discrimination based on gender and other factors. But the problem is that it was used in not just the university settings, by the way, but I think largely in the university settings, in such a way that the accused have virtually no rights. In other words, there's almost no due process. I mean, if there were due process, I mean, I was never allowed to confront or question the accusers. I was not allowed to retain a single document of anything, even though there was no documentation saying that I had done anything wrong. As I said, I was not even allowed to have a lawyer present when I was being grilled. And so the problem is that this doesn't even apply just to professors. Students have been utterly destroyed based on these kinds of allegations in the university setting, because those who are being accused have virtually no rights. And this is was something that Betsy DeVos, the then Secretary of Education, was trying to fix, as I understand it, because there was this recognition that it was so easy to make an unfounded allegation, and yet there was almost no way to combat it or stop it. And how do you prove a negative?
Right.
And so it's really kind of a scary thing, because I think a lot of people do understand that it's easy to make these allegations. You don't have to back it up with any facts, and it can utterly destroy somebody. So it's a great weapon for some people, but it's alarming, and it actually makes me worried for students in college. I mean, actually, not even students in college. I remember reading a story, I forget what news outlet, that said that there were a number of guys, I think in New York, who were installing cameras in their apartments because they were worried that if they brought someone home, that they would be accused of some sort of misconduct, and there would be no proof, but they know how difficult it is to prove that you didn't do anything. And so there's this kind of general fear, I think, out there about the fact that this can happen to anybody.
Yeah.
And it's not even a gender issue. It could happen to a man, a woman. It could happen to anybody. And so it's really something that needs to be fixed.
That's the frightening thing, is hearing some of these stories. And again, it was the Hershey Kiss story that really stuck out to me, because I think I've told such worse stories to people who I really didn't know very well. And it could, if that can bring you down, anything could bring anyone down.
Yeah, I think that's true.
The fact that I think maybe the most sickening fact of all of this to me is the fact that the university during this hearing had a lawyer questioning you, but you weren't allowed to have a lawyer with you. That on its face, I don't see how anyone who believes in any sense of justice or due process can look at that and not be disgusted.
I was going to say, just actually what really also shocked me was that the university did not lift a finger, even though the secretary, whose allegations were shown to be false by the university, they didn't lift a finger, even though she went out publicly on television and elsewhere and utterly ripped me to shreds. When the university had told her that, in signing an agreement with her where she was acknowledging I did nothing wrong, they paid her $5,000, and they told her not to, do this, to go out there publicly and hurt my reputation because it was false. But she went out there anyway, and they didn't do anything about it. They just let her run roughshod over my reputation. And it is what it is, and there's nothing I can do about it. It happened. So.
Do you have a heart out at the top of the hour? Because I want to ask you a little bit about the aftermath and about finding God.
Yeah, please go ahead.
So you got into, during all of this, you started reading the Bible. I think a friend kind of pushed you into doing it. And
yeah, I mean, the way that this all happened, and this is, I think, another positive from the destruction, is that a few years before the destruction, I had a friend. We were investigating a case. And we were chatting, and I said something like, why do bad things happen to good people? Because, when you go into these cases, it's really sad. And he handed me a book. And the book was The Case for Christ by Lee Strobel. And I remember distinctly thinking, I'm not going to read this book. I mean, literally, that was my thought. It was like, I don't believe, I don't. But so he gave me the book, and he's a dear friend of mine. And I remember I happen to be an author, so I do have this tendency, which is I like to read the first page of a book to see how people begin their stories. So I did open the first page, and I started reading it, and it was, I kid you not, the beginning of the book by Lee Strobel was about how he was an investigative reporter, which is what I am, who was investigating a wrongful conviction, which is what I do, and he was doing it from the Chicago area, which is where I was from. And I remember thinking, well, maybe I'll keep reading the rest of this. So I actually read the whole book, and it was a very quick read. And I have to say that I was utterly sort of shocked because I didn't realize that Jesus actually had existed. I thought it was a myth. I knew nothing. And so I remember also thinking as I'm reading the book that he was referring, Lee Strobel, the author, to another book, which was the Bible. And I thought, well maybe I should look at the Bible because that's what he's referring to. So I, opened the Gospels, and that actually just blew my mind. I read the Gospels, straight through, and I remember thinking, wow, this is exactly right, And so the first step for me was I, started to tell my children the stories of Jesus from the Gospels, and they absolutely loved it. So those were like bedtime stories.
Right.
But that was the beginning. But when my life was destroyed in 2018 with these false allegations, people have different reactions to suffering, if you will. Mine was to lie face first in the fibers of the dining room rug. I was taking a lot of Xanax and alcohol. I think I was hoping it was just going to end me, but right. I found myself just like that. But the one thing that I was able to do, I was having trouble concentrating on anything. So I couldn't, watch television. I couldn't look at the internet. I couldn't read a book. But the one thing, and I can't explain this to you, was that I found myself reading books about Jesus. I would order them almost every other day because I'd read them very, very quickly. And for some reason that brought a lot of comfort to me. And at the same time, I started to hear from some friends who were saying, "Are you okay?" And the thing that struck me was I realized that not all of them, but almost all of them happened to be followers of Jesus, which I hadn't really thought about before, but I realized as this was happening, as they were calling me and reaching out, that I felt sort of encircled, if you will, by followers of Jesus. And so that kind of got me through it, And so I think in a sense, it was my faith, that the growing faith, when you're kind of at your lowest and you're in utter pain, I think in some ways we're never closer to God in a way, because we have nothing else to reach out to. And so it was during that period that I was reaching out to God, and I felt very close to God. And actually, I got baptized, and it remains a big part of my life. I read the Bible and pray, and it's an important part of my life.
It's always interesting hearing people who are kind of naturally skeptical how they find God. Are you familiar with the Jefferson Bible? Have you heard of that?
No.
This is what's helped me and what I recommend to a lot of people. Thomas Jefferson kind of edited together his own version of the New Testament, and it's focused on the teachings of Jesus. And he removes a lot of the divine stories, and it's really just on the parables and on the lessons and the life of Jesus.
Yeah.
And that's always helped me. I tend to be too hyper rational. And I suggest that to similar people.
Well, I was the ultimate skeptic. And so a lot of the books that I was reading about Jesus, I was trying to understand the miracles, for instance. And, yet there's actually quite a bit of evidence about Jesus if you actually study it. And, those who witnessed, the Gospels themselves were largely these eyewitness accounts written by people, in most cases who had literally been there or within a certain number of decades. And so this wasn't like, ancient history when they wrote the Gospels.
Right.
Also stuff in there from like Paul saying, look, there were 500 people. If you don't believe me, ask these 500 people, and because they're still around. And yet, do you do that if there's, and how do you explain that people who, like Paul, they went through intense suffering. In fact, they ended up being killed for Peter, who was crucified upside down. for their belief in Jesus. There's actually quite a bit if you're willing to look at it, and then you realize that there's actually quite a bit, aside from the fact what you're talking about, which is that what Jesus actually said, the teachings are certainly not the ravings of a lunatic, right? And this is sort of the C.S. Lewis point, which is that what he said was utterly revolutionary, but applies so much to the world whenever, whether it was his time or today, about the compassion and forgiveness. I mean, I think it's fair to say Jesus has a high standard for us. It's hard to live up to that standard. But when you read it, you realize how perfect it is in about how we should treat each other, how we should have kindness and forgiveness. And it's so moving, actually, if you just look at the lessons. So I always encourage people to do that.
There was a verse that you named your company after, and I wrote it down. I want to make sure I get it right. It's Matthew 5:6. Blessed are they which do hunger. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst after righteousness, for they shall be filled.
Yeah.
When you first saw that, when you're going through all of this, when you're reading that verse, I'm sure that just hits you like a. Can you explain what you're feeling when you read that the first time?
It does, because we're never at a point when we are forgotten by God, and if you're willing to seek, however you define righteousness, if you're willing to try to do and reach out to God to do what you can, you will be filled. And that's the lesson of the Gospels too. I mean, Jesus did not cast out anybody. It was the opposite. He took in the lepers. He touched the lepers. He brought in the tax collectors and fishermen and everybody else. He treated women with respect. He was kind to children. I mean, so it's all about, trying to, we're never at a point when it's too late, I think, is sort of the point too, that we should forgive, that we should have compassion, that we should, give people another chance. I mean, that's exactly what the Gospels are all about, I think.
Yeah. Yeah. And it feels like in this time that we're in, we're so far away from that. And that's where I start feeling very negative. And I think it's just a matter of we each individually have to live that ourselves and just hope that we can pass it on to as many people as we can.
Yeah, I think you're right. I mean, I think we live in a time when faith actually is very much, cordoned off from our lives, for people, people don't go to church, they don't read the Bible, that faith is somehow, and in fact, even like, in my own family, they all thought I was crazy, because I was sending everybody in my family a copy of, The Case for Christ by Lee Strobel, and I don't think any of them read it, by the way. But they all thought I was nuts. But I think it's crazy that you're considered crazy for believing in Jesus, because I actually talked to my father about this, and he was like, "What's this all about?" And I said, "Well, have you read the Gospels?" And he hadn't read them. And I said, "Well, read the Gospels and then let's talk about it, because if you open the Gospels, it's actually accessible to all of us. And I don't think you can come away from the Gospels feeling like that there's something wrong with it, because there isn't. And yet, most people, maybe many people, don't bother with it. So I think you're right. It's almost like on an individual basis, we have to kind of live our lives and share our faith and do what Jesus said, which is to proselytize all nations. And, so it's case by case, but I do think we're kind of in a fallen time in many ways. And I don't know if it's going to get better. Hopefully it will, but I think that faith would bring us back a little bit towards this idea of compassion and forgiveness in the way that we should treat each other. I think that would be a good starting point, in my opinion.
Yeah. And I think I almost don't even think about whether it's going to get better or not. I just think about, well, lots of people have had to live through tough times and figure out how to be good people in those tough times. And you can't control what the greater society is doing. You can only be the best person you can be in the moment that you're in.
Yeah, I think that's so true. I think that's actually quite wise. I think I have a lot of peace because of what you're talking about, which is, I accept my situation. When I pray, I don't pray for things. I pray to do God's will, and, but it is, I think, on an individual basis that we can reach other people, and in small ways, and look, none of us are perfect. and I'm far from perfect, but when I think about, you know, how I live my life, I try to do the right thing, even if I fail at times. And I think that's, you know, understood really by God. But I think we're also reaching out to God. That's a starting point right there, you know, even if there's some skepticism within that reaching out, you know, I think that's okay.
Yeah. Alec, I could talk to you all day, but I want to be respectful of your time. What are you working on now? Where can people find you and support your work?
Well, thanks for that. I mean, first of all, I continue to help inmates and others who have been either wrongfully convicted, excessively sentenced, or are dealing with some other kind of crisis. And so they can reach out to me either through my personal website, which is alecklein.net. That's ALECKLEIN.net. I also have gone into business with my father in two different realms. One is the investigative business, Matthew 56 Investigations, where, as I said, I do help people with their cases. And the other one is Matthew 56 Consulting, where I help people with writing and media projects. And so there's kind of the two areas that I'm familiar with.
Great. And
Yeah.
the book is Aftermath, what it felt like when life was over. It really is such an excellent book. If you're going through a tough time, it's a blueprint for really how to get through these things and to not feel like you're alone, because as we've talked about, there's so many people now who are going through literally exactly what you've gone through, but so many other tough things in today's world.
It's true, because I'll talk to people and they talk about some sort of illness that they're going through, or some sort of financial crisis, or some other family drama. And I realize, you know, we're all dealing with difficulties, whatever the case may be. It may not be Me Too, maybe something else. And, you know, I think in some ways, hopefully the book is helpful and brings comfort to people who are struggling with what they're going through. You know, that would make me happy.
And I want to make sure I said the title. It's Aftermath, When It Felt Like Life Was Over. Alec Klein, thank you so much. I really do appreciate your time.
Thanks so much for having me. I appreciate it.